This is Here's How, Ireland's political, social and current affairs podcast, presented by William Campbell.
Thank you for downloading episode 99 of Here's How for the 21st of February 2020. We've had an election, but what happens next? This podcast has two interviews that try to get an insight into the character of the next government.
Here's How is Ireland's political, social and current affairs podcast. Make your view heard. Just dial 076 603 5060 and tell the world what you're thinking. Your voicemail may be included in the next podcast. You can find tips on recording your contribution and other ways to contact the show at here'show.ie/call.
Here's what we've got coming up for you in this podcast. A Fianna Fáil Fine Gael coalition government would essentially be a suicide pact.
Yes, but I think the public might welcome that. We're in a very, very different Ireland to the Ireland that saw Fine Gael.
Pause, Michael, pause that there for a second. The public might welcome that. That doesn't necessarily mean that either of their votes would recover. That's coming up shortly. First, I want to thank all of my donors on Patreon. I really appreciate everyone who does that. If you don't know, Patreon is a system that allows people to donate $1 or $2 per podcast or per month, and that helps me to devote more time to research and to finding interesting guests. If you think that you could do the same, there's details on the website and at the end of the show. So we're past the election, and I have two post-election interviews. Shortly, you'll hear from the veteran former Irish Times parliamentary correspondent, Michael O'Regan, and we'll discuss the position of each of the parties who are currently dancing around each other and the various coalition possibilities, and see if an analysis of their motivation will give us any insight into the possibilities for what will happen next. But first, I managed to grab an interview with Sinn Féin's Angus O'Snuddy at the election count in the RDS. To put this in context, Angus O'Snuddy got one of the highest votes of any politician in the country, and at the moment I spoke to him, those votes were being counted and tallied. It might have been quicker to weigh them. So, of course, I started with congratulating him on his vote, but I really wanted to ask him about a topic that I think is very relevant given the possibility that was emerging then of Sinn Féin going into government. The Cash for Ash scandal in Northern Ireland, whereby some people in the know, often DUP supporters, made huge amounts of money claiming subsidies for renewable heating that were vastly higher than what they actually spent on the heating bills. To Sinn Féin's credit, it's clear that their politicians did not have sticky hands in the till on this, unlike some others. But the inquiry into this revealed a series of emails that Sinn Féin clearly would rather have remained secret, and it's clear that the emails were written in the belief that they would never come to light. Martin O'Mullor was the Sinn Féin finance minister in the Northern Ireland executive from 2016 to 2017 when the executive collapsed. O'Mullor wrote an email to Ted Howell. Howell is a secretive figure who largely disappeared in the early 1970s, probably to work for the IRA outside Ireland, and he re-emerged on the Ard Comhairle of Sinn Féin during the peace process. No serious commentator doubts that Howell was one of the closest confidants to Gerry Adams and a senior member of the Provisional IRA. And the email that Sinn Féin Finance Minister Martin O'Mullor sent to Howell asked whether he, Howell, was content if the writer, O'Mullor, would make particular decisions in his capacity as minister. That's dodgy as hell. It's also extra-constitutional. Ministers, north or south, have a particular duty in law, and that is to make executive decisions. They're not supposed to be the vassal for other people's decisions. Whatever about actions in the past, any minister elected now has a duty to be the bona fide person who is answerable to the electorate for what they do, not answerable to an entity, any entity, that meets in private. That's the context for some of the questions that I ask Angus O'Snuddy here.
Angus O'Snuddy, Dublin South Central, you think you'll just about scrape over the line?
I will scrape over the line if that's what you can. Once you scrape over the line, whether it's 1 or 1,000, it makes no difference. It's the people in the area have put their faith in you. In this occasion, I'm just overwhelmed by the support. Kind of a substantial vote for Sinn Féin.
You came under a lot of attack from Fine Gael, and they had very targeted attacks. Do you think it might have brought down the vote? Do you think it might have brought it up?
No, I think people have seen through kind of Fine Gael's attacks and kind of some of the print media in particular who go at us every single election, and kind of in this case I think people stayed focused on the key issues in their lives, in particular housing and health, but also childcare and insurance, where those 4 issues were the main issues that resonated with the public and the message that we had sent out.
And you'll be aware in the Burns book on Cash for Ash that there was stories of how Sinn Féin ministers were consulting with people who were not senior in the party. Do you think that people have genuine fears, be they not necessarily the voters, but people in the political class have genuine fears that somebody who might end up a Sinn Féin minister is not the person who is the bona fide decision maker?
No, the decision makers are always Sinn Féin person. We have a North Cora which is elected quite openly every single year. Yeah. We have a parliamentary party which meets in the Dáil. We also have a parliamentary party in the Assembly, and in Europe. Unlike other parties, kind of there is a difficulty if you have parliamentary parties in 2 jurisdictions at the same time, so it can complicate. So often we have to kind of ask each other, what position are you adopting, what position? And there are people who are well trusted within the party who have been involved at the highest level of negotiating the Good Friday Agreement, kind of St Andrews, and sometimes you will ask, kind of, what's your opinion? That doesn't mean that you are forced to accept their opinion.
Some of those emails, though, seem more like asking for permission than asking for an opinion.
Genuinely, I know both people who are involved, and kind of I know that wouldn't be the case. And I know in Leinster House, kind of our party as a whole, the membership takes policy decisions in an open forum, which is the Ardesh, and then kind of we as parliamentarians have to abide by that 100%. And there's a policy unit kind of within the party in Leinster House, and we will ask their advice. They are kind of advisors, no different to what a minister would have as an advisor, and kind of you have to. So there's quite every single minister in this state and other states have special advisors appointed to them who aren't elected, who are asked their advice, and in the past some of them
once in a while they get controversial.
Well, yes, kind of we had PJ Mara in the past and people like that, and they become spin doctors and they're spinning in a certain way, and we should never go down that road. People should be asked their opinion and give their opinion freely, and whether it's taken on board or not, that's a decision for the parliamentary party, based on what policy. Other parties take their decisions kind of from a policy from themselves in Leinster House or elsewhere.
And the public clearly rejected bringing in a murder that happened 13 years ago into the political frame. You can see that in the votes that are being counted today. Would you say, though, that there's a reasonable concern for people's attitude to that? And you'll be aware that during the Troubles, various Sinn Féin people, possibly including yourself, were asked to condemn particular actions by the IRA, and they went up to a line but didn't cross that line of condemning it. Would that murder in particular be something that you could say that was a murder and that should be condemned and the people involved should go to jail?
We have said from day one, in terms of those who were involved in the very, very brutal killing of Paul Quinn.
Would you say killing, and that's a word that was applied to be much more general, would you agree that was a murder?
Well, no, murder is a premeditated action of killing somebody, and that's a court decides that, but I've no problem in saying that kind of Paul Quinn's was murder. I don't have a problem, I never had, but you must remember there's a whole context of a war. And kind of there's a lot more than those with Paul Quinn. My biggest problem with Paul Quinn being used as a political tool in this election is the very people who've used it will disappear next week, and you'll never hear again. Well, maybe not till the next election. And kind of Paul Quinn's family were right to demand the apology, and kind of hindsight's a great thing, and Conor Murphy should have given the apology kind of a lot earlier.
There's something that happens, you'll be aware, Angus, you'll be aware that on RTE very frequently, and not least in your constituency, when someone is killed, within seconds an RTE reporter will be able to say that person was well known to Gardaí. And Vincent Brown tweeted during the week that that's essentially a message to say this is one that polite society doesn't need to worry about.
Well, that's wrong.
Yeah, but isn't what Conor Murphy said something like that, to say, he was just a criminal, that you don't really need to worry about this?
There's quite a number of people at the time of Paul Quinn's murder kind of said the exact same thing, including kind of a former Taoiseach and the International Monitoring Committee. And so a lot of people got it wrong. But that doesn't...
Would you accept they got it wrong?
That doesn't justify what happened to Paul Quinn in any shape or form, and sometimes kind of the likes of the comments you just said are used nearly to justify, or as you said, and that's wrong. Kind of, it's a man who died in this case, and it's a very tragic death.
But would you be happy saying that there's nobody behind the scenes who are saying that was don't be condemning those people, don't be calling that a murder?
Anybody with any information on this should go to the police. It doesn't matter where they are, what their history is, or whatever. Go to the police now, or they should have done it before now, and give that information. And those who carried out that brutal killing and others, murder. As I said, kind of, it's the court decides whether it's murder or manslaughter or whatever. In this case, it is a killing which I believe is murder because it was premeditated. And that they should go. They should suffer the consequences of the law. That justice should be seen to be done for the family and for society as a whole, not just in this one, but in quite a number of others we've seen over the years who had absolutely nothing to do with a war. The war was over.
Angus O'Sully, congratulations on your vote. Are you kicking yourself that you didn't have a running mate?
Well, hindsight's a great thing, but sure, that's the way it is. Kind of up to the first week in the election, kind of the polls weren't predicting anything like what we've seen.
Do you agree? Do you disagree? If you want your point of view heard, dial 076 603 5060 and leave a contribution for the show. The lines are open 24/7 and you can find tips on how to record a good contribution and other ways to contact the podcast at here'show.ie/call.
On the line now, I have Michael O'Regan. He's a journalist. He's the former parliamentary correspondent of the Irish Times, so he knows politicians and politics backwards and forwards. And we heard there from Sinn Féin's Angus O'Snuddy that there are different pressures on different parties going into government, and that's what I want to look at. But let's maybe just look internally at Sinn Féin. Is there any hesitancy, do you think, Michael, within Sinn Féin of going into government in principle?
Not in principle, no. I think there might be some hesitancy in terms of strategy. They may well feel that another period in opposition might consolidate the gains they had made in the election, perhaps do much better. Now, that's a high-risk strategy, of course, because it's assuming that the government that will be put in place will not work. But certainly no resistance at all in principle. And many of the Sinn Féin TDs I've been speaking to over the years, they would relish an opportunity to be a minister.
Yeah, I think you're right. And I started with Sinn Féin because I think it might hurt some people to say it, but I think their motives are purist. If you look at any of the other parties, they are probably quite conflicted about going into government. And I think maybe the next least conflicted party is Fine Gael, because they're in bits. I get the feeling that morale in Fine Gael is absolutely on the floor, and they need time to rebuild and to essentially lick their wounds. It would really be very, very difficult for them to go into government in a much reduced state, maybe only having 5 or 6 ministers and formerly more senior people now taking very junior roles.
That's one way of looking at it, but then you have to contrast that with the dreary uplands of the opposition benches. And it brings to mind, of course, Mary Harney's famous text to John Gormley of the Greens when they were in government together, that the worst day in government is better than the best day in opposition. So there's certainly a mood within some in Fine Gael that they should go into opposition. But the opportunity for Leo Varadkar to be a Taoiseach again, admittedly probably a rotating Taoiseach, and some others to be ministers, is attractive. And also, they will have to look to the public. And if the public see them, perceive them not to be available for government in a situation where, you could conceivably have another election, although I think that's doubtful, then the public just might turn on them. It's a precarious high-wire act by Fine Gael at the moment. I don't think they're handling it that well, because I think they're stressing this desire to go into opposition too much. The other thing about this election, of course, is nobody won the election. To win an election, you have to secure an overall majority. Now, nobody's got that. So from that point of view, all parties theoretically are available for government, or should be available for government.
And then, of course, we come to Fianna Fáil, and Fianna Fáil really must be conflicted, because they have at least three viable options, or at least two viable options, one perhaps less than the other two, which is to go into government with Fine Gael, or to attempt that, or to go into government with Sinn Féin. And both of them are absolute minefields. In particular, I've heard expressed by people who are well versed in politics that a Fianna Fáil Fine Gael coalition government would essentially be a suicide pact. They've kept up a Punch and Judy show ever since the Civil War of having very little difference in policy, but just difference in character, and when one is in, the other is out. If they're both on the same side of the fence, that's the end of that game, isn't it?
Yes, but I think the public might welcome that. We're in a very, very different Ireland to the Ireland that saw Fine Gael.
Pause, Michael, pause that there for a second. The public might welcome that. That doesn't necessarily mean that either of their votes would recover.
Well, you see, it's very hard to say. I mean, if you look back to the Fianna Fáil's decline post the crash, for instance, and there was talk of Fianna Fáil, might just fade away, which was actually nonsense, in the sense that Fianna Fáil is a political party with elements of an organisation right around the country in each parish, admittedly diminished, and perhaps older age profile would be older than it used to be, but and yet Fianna Fáil recovered. Harold Wilson's great dictum, "A week is a long time in politics," is very, very relevant here. I think the people, the Ireland of today, would give short shrift to either Fine Gael or Fianna Fáil being precious enough, as the public might see it, in saying, look, we couldn't possibly do a deal with the ancient political enemy, the two parties born out of the aftermath of the Civil War. So from that point of view, I think things have changed. I was around in 1989, for instance, covering politics, when Fianna Fáil did a deal with the Progressive Democrats. Now, that would have been unthinkable at one time, because the Progressive Democrats were led by Des O'Malley. He had been expelled from Fianna Fáil for conduct unbecoming, which was the phrase in the Corú. O'Malley once said that Charles Haughey, the then leader of Fianna Fáil, was unfit for public office. So politics can be a very practical business.
Sure. And do you think then that there's a tension between long-term interest and short-term interest, that short-term, a Fine Gael Fianna Fáil coalition would deliver both of them into government and power, and as you say, a good day in opposition isn't nearly as good as a bad day in government. Do you think that the short-term interest of getting into government might overcome the long-term danger that then they would create a very, very viable left-wing opposition?
I think it would, given the nature of politics. Also, I think that if Fine Gael and Fianna Fáil go into government together, they will go in with the Greens. They need the numbers anyway. They'll go into with the Greens and the Social Democrats, and that will take away the perception of the grand coalition between Fine Gael and Fianna Fáil, which members of both parties might have stronger reservations about. It would also give a new look to that government, the government of change. Change is now the buzzword. And I suspect that the Greens and Social Democrats would play a very, very prominent role in that kind of government. But politics is very unpredictable. It's very mercurial. And the assumption seems to be that if you did put in a government in place involving Fine Gael, Fianna Fáil, the Greens and the Soc Dems, that in some way Sinn Féin might sweep the boards at the next election. Now that's assuming that the government you put in place is a failure. Now if that government got the key issues of health and housing right, perhaps climate change as well, but particularly health and housing, then it could be re-elected.
But surely all governments are failures. All governments are eventually voted out of office. In Ireland, more quickly perhaps than in other countries. As Enoch Powell said, all political careers end in failure.
They do, yes. That could be argued. But on the other hand, there's now such a crisis in housing and health that it requires an element of focus by a majority government, not a minority government as we had, a majority government. And if that government could get it right, then I think the public would look much more benignly on it.
To talk about maybe the minor coalition partners that you mentioned there, I spoke to a very senior source in the Green Party who said that in order, and this was before the results of the election were announced, and they said that in order to go into coalition, they would want both to be wanted and needed. Now, whether they're wanted might be difficult to judge, but they're not needed. Surely Fine Gael and Fianna Fáil, between them, if you throw in the independents who are out of the Fine Gael and Fianna Fáil gene pool, we're not asking to, include left-wing independents, just the independents very closely aligned to one of those parties or who have previously allied themselves to one of those parties like Grealish and Lowry, they easily get the numbers, don't they?
They may get the numbers, they may get the numbers, but I think that would be a very fragile government, and it would look as if Fine Gael and Fianna Fáil were coming together to secure power and using the so-called gene pool independence. Also, some of the gene pool independents would look for ministries, I think. It would be a difficult enough government, I think, to manage.
But if you're looking at this from the point of view of the Greens or the Soc Dems, surely they're saying, hang on a second, if we go into this government, we have really zero negotiating power because the only power of a minor coalition partner is to walk out. And them, one for sure, and possibly both of them walking out, would be unlikely to collapse the government. So they would basically, essentially, whenever they made a demand, they would get the answer, so what are you going to do about it?
Yeah, but I think, you see, in the circumstances we have now, I think the Greens and the Soc Dems are in a hugely powerful position because there is a mood for change. That's established. The swing to Sinn Féin was based on anger and frustration with an inability to deal with housing and health and other issues, young people unable to buy a house and all that kind of thing. So from that point of view, the Greens and Soc Dems would be looking at a fairly battered Fine Gael and battered Fianna Fáil, and their negotiating power would be quite strong. In the same way as back in the day in 1989, the Progressive Democrats knew that Fianna Fáil needed them to secure power, so their bargaining position was quite strong. If you go back to 92... But
surely, Michael, if we were, say, 2 years down the road, the government wasn't working so well, the Greens wanted to demand some changes, they wouldn't be in that much of a powerful situation because they can, Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael could say, we can bring in Lowry and Naughton and Grealish and a couple of Healy-Rays and a few other people we haven't heard of very much, and you can't knock us out with a confidence vote.
Yeah, but I think that's easier said than done. And relying on independents, I think if you rely on a few independents, maybe 2 or 3, you're probably okay on that if they're looking for constituency deals and that. But if you're looking for a significant number of diverse independents to keep you in power, then I think the situation becomes very, very vulnerable. And also Fine Gael and Fianna Fáil would be looking to the electorate. I mean, if they couldn't make a government work with the Greens and Soc Dems, then I think the wrath of the electorate would be focused on them in the next election.
One party that we haven't mentioned is the Labour Party. They're really in no position to do anything, are they?
No, they're not. They need opposition. They will elect a new leader.
It didn't do much good for them the last time.
No, it did not. It did not. But I think the problem for Labour the last time was not so much their performance in government, but the promises they made in the general election campaign, where they really, it became option politics, down to running, if you remember, a Tesco type ad in the newspapers, warning about a Fine Gael overall majority, which seemed a possibility, although I thought unlikely at the time. And I think they reaped the whirlwind of promising too much in an election campaign.
And lastly, the last option, perhaps, is another election. There's a Red C poll out in which Sinn Féin have shot up from their election performance. They're on 35%. And I note that the Greens are also on 9%. You add those two and you're at 44. That's coming very close to a majority. Now, they don't have that, and that's not an election. That's only an opinion poll. But you can tell me what your opinion of it is, but my thesis is that between Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael, they have the power to make sure that an election doesn't happen. And with the kicking they got, they don't want to go back for more of that. Therefore, there will be no election.
I would agree with that, yes. I think there will be no election for that reason. And I think if you look at right across Leinster House and all the TDs there of all political colour and none, independents as well, nobody wants another election. Okay, Sinn Féin may think that it might be no harm for us given the opinion polls, but I think Sinn Féin would welcome a period where they can settle down, perhaps in opposition, and prepare then for the next election, rather than an immediate election. Although of all the parties, they'd have less to fear than anyone else. But I would agree, nobody wants another election in Leinster House.
You've teed up my final question very, very well, because you said that even Sinn Féin want a period of consolidating their success. It's clear they didn't expect the level of success that they got, and that can be seen in what I think is probably fair to say a poor level of vetting of a couple of their candidates. We have one candidate making very anti-scientific, anti-vax statements. Another, now TD, has taken her Twitter offline after people went through it and found a number of extraordinary statements, stuff that definitely would be considered anti-Semitic. Do you think that's just teething pains, that'll go away, or that they will have real problems from having some TDs who are maybe not of the calibre of the people they've had in the past, all?
Well, they will now have TDs with no experience really of politics. Some failed to get elected to local authorities. Some were clearly just token candidates in some constituencies. And they were chosen, of course, before the polls showed this dramatic surge to Sinn Féin. So there will be some teething problems, I would think, with some of the TDs, new TDs, who may not really fully realise, perhaps at this stage, the discipline required in being a member of the Dáil and settling down to constituency work, the hard grind of constituency work, and supporting party policy. So they may be on a fairly steep learning curve. We have to see just how quickly they learn. But it won't be all champagne and roses for Sinn Féin.
And Sinn Féin have a pretty poor record of hanging on to councillors and TDs. Do you expect that to accelerate slightly?
That depends. I think a party that's growing like Sinn Féin and still, perhaps relatively new to the Dáil, relatively speaking, that there are going to be teething problems always within the parliamentary party and within the organisation. But they'll now be buoyed up by the fairly spectacular performance in the general election, and they will feel the wind behind them. And the challenge for the party is, if it does go into opposition, the challenge for the party is to grow and to remain relevant. Finally,
Michael, do you think we will have a good quality government coming out of this process?
I think there's a possibility that we might, because there's now so much uncertainty, I suppose, on the political landscape. As I say, nobody won this election. Nobody secured an overall majority. The surge to Sinn Féin has shown that people are in a very volatile mood and won't take easily to a new government not making progress, particularly in health and housing. And I think that just might be the spur to a new government to actually deliver.
Michael O'Regan, journalist, former parliamentary correspondent of the Irish Times and Twitter rock star, thank you very much for talking to me.
Thank you, William.
Never miss a show. Follow at Here's How Podcast on Twitter and like Here's How on Facebook for updates on each show's contents.
Go to the website for sources and references from the show, and while you're there you can like the show on Facebook, follow the show on Twitter at Here's How Podcast, and follow Michael O'Regan at Michael_O_Regan, and get in touch with me if you can suggest a guest or a topic for a future show. Thanks again to all the patrons on Patreon. Their donations allow me to devote time to research and finding interesting guests. And if you could do the same as them and donate $1 or $2 per podcast or per month, go to patreon.com/here'show. That link is on the website. Also there you can find out how to subscribe to the podcast for free on your computer, on your phone or by email. All the information is at www.here'show.ie. The Here's How podcast is produced and presented by me, William Campbell. Thank you for listening.